Today's brown bag lunch. I'm really delighted to be introducing Frances Sohns, and doubly so because she's talking about Robert Adam, whom I have everybody loves Robert Adam, but I always feel as if I have a sort of personal link to Robert Adam, as if he's channeling something, or I am. He went to my school in Edinburgh, and I used to walk past one of his most famous buildings every day till I was 16. And then when I went to Edinburgh University, I had to walk through the main gateway, which he designed, since he'd also been a student there. And then when I went to do my postgraduate work, it was in the Courtauld Institute in London, in a townhouse designed by Robert Adam. So I feel as if he has been haunting me, and that's not so bad. But I'm particularly pleased to be introducing Frances Sohns, because some of you in the audience here will remember that Frances introduced us to Adam's drawings when bar term abroad in London went to the Soane Museum, because Frances is the keeper of the drawings and the library collections at Sir John Soane's Museum, where she looks after a vast array of books and drawings. But I think it's fair to say that even in the Soane Museum, the Adam drawings are the jewel of the drawings collection, at least. And indeed what makes, it's really through the Soane's collection that we understand Adam's working practices, because that is by far the largest collection of the surviving drawings by Adam and from his studio. Now, Frances has a considerable background in this. She wrote her PhD on one of Adam's principal country houses, and since moving to the Soane Museum, she's been very actively involved in cataloguing and interpreting, particularly the Adam collection. And indeed, currently in the Soane Museum is an exhibition called Robert Adam's London, curated by Frances, and she is also the author of the accompanying book on Robert Adam's London. So today, as you can see, she's going to be talking about architecture, innovation and legacy, but what first became announced as the late Mr. Robert Adam, which I think we're going to be hearing more about. So please join me in welcoming Frances Sohns to the Barry Graduate Centre.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, for those of you who were in London recently, apologies, we're going to have a little bit of repetition, but I'm sure you can cope with it because it's such a lovely subject. And also, I need to apologise. I've made a hideous English mistake. On my title slide, I've written Bard Graduate Centre. Wrong. It's not a typo, it's just the way the English spell centre, so apologies for that. Hideous. So rude to get my host's name wrong. Apologies for that. Now, I have written myself notes and I tend not to read them, so if I'm whittling away, wave at me. Robert Adam is doubtless one of the British architects about whom more has been written than any other, with perhaps the exception of Christopher Wren. So we know a great deal about him, but still I'm going to introduce him to you anyway. He was born in 1728, and he was the second of 8 children to another architect, a gentleman called William Adam. So Robert grew up in comfort and relative wealth at the family estate, Blair Adam, near Edinburgh, and as Paul told you, of course, went to Edinburgh High School and then, of course, Edinburgh University, all during the Scottish Enlightenment and surrounded by some of the greatest minds of his generation. So he had a really very good start in life. He didn't complete his studies at Edinburgh University. He left in 1745 because his father, William, this very successful architect, became unwell. So the two oldest boys, John and Robert, decided that they would move into their family architectural practice and sort of take over, look after the show, as it were, while their father was unwell. This was particularly important because the family firm had just received an extremely lucrative commission. Following the Jacobite uprising of 1745, the British Hanoverian government decided to keep the Catholics under control, particularly in Scotland, where there were lots of Catholics, by building a series of military forts, filling them with soldiers, and any time the Catholic Scots threatened to misbehave, they would be crushed forthwith. And the office of William Adam was given this commission to build this series of military installations across Scotland, and very lucrative it was too. And of course they wanted to hold on to the commission despite the fact that their principal architect had become unwell. So John and Robert took over. Unfortunately, William, their father, died 3 years later in 1748, and John, the eldest brother, became the senior partner of the firm. Now, it works. Hurrah. This is a photograph of Fort George, one of those military installations. This is probably the one on which Robert did the most work, and indeed he made a personal fortune of around £5,000 working on the Hanoverian Highland forts. You can see they are, for the 18th century, quite technologically advanced. Many of them survive. They're incredibly robust. This one is actually open to the public if you fancy it, if you're in the area. So Robert made a good amount of money working on the Hanoverian Highland forts, and he decided that he would utilise those savings by undertaking a grand tour, not for pleasure, but for education. Robert travelled through France to Italy. He set off in 1754. He took with him a great deal of money, of course, so he was able to employ draftsmen to make drawings of all that he saw. He was also able to employ the French artist Charles-Louis Clerisseau as his drawing master. These are 3 examples of drawings which Robert himself made during his grand tour. Top left, you've got a fantasy, or a detail of a fantasy royal palace. Obviously not an architectural design. I don't think there would be a human being in Christendom who could afford to build such a monstrosity. On the right-hand side, you've got the tomb of Virgil, and underneath is a scheme for... Oh dear, I can't remember, I beg your pardon. It is a lovely scheme for a town, and I can't remember which town it is. But anyway, so under why are we skipping? Not sure. Under the tutelage of Clerisseau, Adam learnt to draw in an entirely new way. In his father's practice, he had learnt to draw in a very sort of picturesque, beautiful style, but under Clerisseau he took on this sort of elegant, realistic, albeit often very sketch-like technique, and it was a technique that he was to maintain for the rest of his career, albeit with a few forays back into the picturesque later on in his life, but largely just for pleasure. Towards the end of Adam's grand tour, 1757, he approached the Venetian authorities for a permit to visit Spoleto in Dalmatia, Split in modern-day Croatia, of course. Worth visiting if you've not been, it's fabulous. Robert wanted to go, it was under Venetian control at the time, which is why he needed permission, to go and make a series of survey drawings of the surviving ruins of the palace of the Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian, of course, essentially retired to Split. I can see why. It's a lovely place. We say the ruins of the palace of Diocletian. It's not really so ruinous. It's a rather fabulous building that's largely all just still there. Robert went along. He took his draftsman, made multiple drawings of what he saw. Unfortunately, he didn't get quite as long in Split as he had hoped for, simply because he was accused of being a spy, and he had to do all his work in 5 weeks. So he managed to make an architectural survey of a city in 5 weeks, which is utterly extraordinary and rather impressive, but it meant that when he got home he was able to publish an architectural treatise entitled The Ruins of the Palace of the Emperor Diocletian at Spoleto in Dalmatia, bit of a mouthful, in 1764. Now this was a rather shrewd move. Architectural treatises in Britain up to this point had largely focused on the religious and public architecture of the antique. Robert, on the other hand, was focusing on domestic architecture, albeit, as you can see, extremely grand imperial domestic architecture. So Robert was sort of giving the British public a fabulous in-depth taste of the domestic architecture of the antique. Sorry, I'm not sure why we're skipping, but I'll just ignore it. And really kind of set himself up as an authority in domestic architecture, which of course was a very useful thing to do, seeing as he was catering to a burgeoning market of country house builders during the 18th century British building boom. Now then. On his return from his grand tour in 1758, Robert decided that despite his family's wishes, he was not going to return to Scotland and work under the authority of his older brother John. Instead, he was going to travel to London. He didn't even bother going home for a family visit. He went to London, he took out a mortgage and acquired a house at 75 Lower Grosvenor Street, a very elegant part of town. It was a typical London terraced house, 3 bays wide, and at the rear he built what he called his casino, the octagonal room on the left-hand side of the top drawing, which was essentially his museum at the back of his house for his grand tour collection. And in that space he arranged all his beautiful works of art and antiquity and his books and his drawings, and he invited the elite of society in London to come and view his collection, sort of see him to be the great antiquarian architect that he was, and then of course lure them in and get them to spend all their money on buildings which he had designed. And it worked rather well. Why? There we go. It worked very well. So within a couple of years, Robert had drawn around him a vast network of patrons who commissioned all manner of designs from him. He was extraordinarily diverse. He worked on houses, both urban and rural, but also churches, church furniture, interior design, furniture itself, rustic lodges, funerary monuments. He did it all, really. I believe he was actually more diverse than any of his other contemporaries, so he did jolly well, but he was also extremely busy, so he needed a partner in his architectural practice. And thankfully for him, his younger brother James also misbehaved and refused to return to Scotland. And after his own grand tour, 1760 to 63, he followed Robert to London and joined Robert's practice as the junior partner. So Robert and James were in it together. Collectively, they employed some of the greatest artisans of the time, so people like Biagio, Rebecca, Angelica Kaufmann, Antonio Zucchi, all decorative painters, as well as the plasterer Joseph Rose, the cabinet makers Thomas Chippendale, John Linnell, Inson Mayhew, etc., etc. So they were working at a very, very high quality and calibre, and they themselves took design responsibility for everything that was churned out of the office. They would produce these rather sweet, albeit scrappy, preliminary designs. No one else in the office was allowed to actually undertake any design work. It all had to come from Robert and James. These are 4 designs in Robert's own hand. Top left, as you can see, a gravy boat for Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire. It was produced, it's silver, it's in a nice display. Bottom left, the library ceiling for Chardelots, just outside London. Bottom right, you have the Edinburgh Riding House, sadly demolished since its execution. But if you were a smart urbanite in Edinburgh in the 18th century, and you didn't want to have to go out to the country in order to learn to ride, you would go to this building and be taught. So very useful. And then top right, we've got a funerary monument for Admiral Edward Boscawen. Again, fairly typical of Adam. Adam did produce quite an array of funerary monuments. We don't think of him as an architect of funerary architecture, but indeed he was, and this is one example with a lovely rostral column because, of course, Admiral Boscawen was a naval gentleman. So, Robert and James would produce these lovely little preliminary sketches. They would be handed over to their team of draftsmen who would then make beautiful presentation drawings. They're called presentation drawings simply because they were made to present to a client. and persuade them to undertake a particular design. Here, just 3 examples. Top left, the ceiling, a fabulous ceiling, for the famous glass drawing room at Northumberland House. Now, you might not have heard of Northumberland House. That's because it was demolished in the 1860s to make way for Northumberland Avenue, just off Trafalgar Square in London. The glass drawing room, however, was extremely famous because the walls were lined with glass. Incredibly opulent. Sadly, when the house was demolished, those glass panels were taken away and leased out to decorate the inside of marquees when people were having weddings and parties. So not a huge number of them survive, but those that do are in the Victoria and Albert Museum. To the right of that, a lovely pink sofa that was designed for a gentleman called Sir Lawrence Dundas, a very wealthy merchant who lived on Arlington Street in London. This sofa, which was executed by Thomas Chippendale, is thought to have been the most expensive piece of seat furniture produced during the 18th century. It was not upholstered in pink, needless to say. Bottom right, you have very, very famous, a depiction of a very famous room. This is one wall elevation for the fabulous Etruscan dressing room at Osterley Park. Adam produced 8 Etruscan rooms. He called them Etruscan because they took on that sort of black, orange and gold colour scheme of so-called Etruscan urns. And this is the best surviving example. So if you manage to visit Osterley, don't miss it. It's fabulous. But anyway, Robert and James have produced scrappy sketches. Their draftsmen then produce these really elegant, beautiful drawings to show to clients to persuade them to part with their money. So, Robert and James had a very characteristic style. It's of course called the Adam style. It was designed in deliberate contrast to the more severe Neo-Palladian style that had dominated Britain for 30 years before the Adam brothers came along. And they instigated this fashion for the Adam style by using a wider arsenal of decorative motifs than their predecessors had done, essentially collating all that they'd seen abroad. Not so much a dogmatic take on archaeological accuracy, but more a sort of creative fusion of everything they'd experienced, with lots of colour thrown in and no flat surfaces. So this is the beautiful painted breakfasting room for Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire, sadly not executed, but a great example of the kinds of things that Robert and James were doing with interior design. So fabulous curving walls, niches, domes, incredibly opulent plasterwork, all of course painted, and then some gilding thrown in to boot. The Adam brothers currently enjoy a great reputation for variety. People always say, oh, the Adam brothers, they never duplicated a design. I'm afraid that's completely wrong. I recently debunked that theory. While I was cataloguing 166 drawings for a project called the Adelphi, which I'm going to talk more about shortly, but it was essentially a speculative urban development of townhouses, so multiple houses. I was cataloguing these drawings and I discovered that every, or nearly every single one of the chimney pieces for this great big urban development at the Adelphi was either a duplication or a close variant of something that Robert had designed during the 10 years preceding. So essentially, when it came time for Robert to design several hundred chimney pieces for this urban development, he clearly just went through all of the drawings in his office and sifted out designs which could be reproduced. So on the left-hand side of the screen there, you have the chimney piece, which was designed and indeed installed in the front parlour, that's the front ground floor room, at number 4 Royal Terrace, which was a beautiful terrace overlooking the River Thames, so the number 4 on that terrace. On the right-hand side, rather familiar, isn't it? We have a chimney piece designed for the drawing room at Blenheim House for a chap called Colonel John Campbell. This chimney piece for Campbell was designed a year before the Adelphi was constructed, and you can see that the Adelphi chimney piece is an exact duplicate of that from Blenheim. Fortunately, however, the Blenheim chimney piece was never executed, so in this case it's not quite such terrible faux pas. But what I discovered when I realised that these chimney pieces were duplicates was that I needed to have a closer look, because a lot of these drawings, if you look very, very closely, they have hidden secrets. I'm afraid you can't see on these slides because the photographs aren't of high enough quality, but on the one on the left, in very faint pencil, Robert himself has written chimney piece for the front parlour, 5th house. Confusingly, number 4 was the 5th house in the terrace, but anyway. And on the Blenheim chimney piece drawing, on the right-hand side, he wrote riverfront, front parlour, 5th house. So it sort of justifies my theory that Adam simply sifted through his drawings and scribbled on, oh yes, I'll have that one in the 5th house, or I'll have that one in the 4th house. So I'm afraid he did duplicate. He wasn't quite as original as people like to think, but still, he was, why? Please go back. There we are. He was generally very original and prolific, despite this one or a few cheats along the way. So, by producing such a huge number of designs for over 350 patrons during the course of a 40-year career, Robert and James amassed enormous wealth. And they decided that they would use this wealth to really kind of concrete their legacy on the London architectural skyline, as it were. They were always keen to undertake big public commissions. They'd learned from their work on the Highland Hanoverian forts how lucrative and useful they were for making themselves successful. Unfortunately, in London, all of the public commissions tended to be going to Robert and James's principal rival, Sir William Chambers. The reason that Chambers got the big jobs was because he was really good friends with King George III. He'd actually been King George III's tutor when the king had been a little boy. So Robert didn't really get a look in. So because he wasn't able to do a big public commission paid for out of public money, Robert and James decided they would use their wealth in order to build something on a public scale in London, as I say, to sort of concrete their reputation in place. So, in 1769, Robert and James, in partnership with their 2 other brothers, the older brother John from up in Edinburgh, and their younger brother William, who was ever so slightly useless, they clubbed together and they took out a 99-year lease on a strip of boggy land along the north bank of the River Thames in central London. It was a sloping bog, previously called Durham Yard, because it had been where the medieval Bishop of Durham's palace had been located. But it really was a bog, running from the Strand, 40 feet above the river, right down to the riverbank. There was no Victorian embankment at that point, so it would have been smelly. At high tide, it would have flooded. Just revolting, frankly. And they decided on this bog to build what you're looking at, the Adelphi, which I mentioned a moment ago. This incredible speculative development of over 60 townhouses built on this enormous series of vaulted undercrofts, which contains stabling and storage and subterranean roadways, and then the houses on top. Not enormous houses, they were really more sort of pied-à-terre type situations, but very beautiful, a nice sort of little London bolt hole, that sort of thing. But, as you can imagine, to build such an enormous development, despite their wealth, the Adam brothers did have to take out quite large loans. They took out over £200,000 in loans to get this thing built. That's because they needed to employ 3,000 Irishmen to get the buildings up. They initially employed Scots, but they didn't work hard enough, so they employed Irishmen instead. Unfortunately, as the Irishmen were coming to an end and the fabric was completed in 1772, there was a run on the Scottish banks, widely thought to have really been caused by the looming American Revolutionary War. Everyone was getting rather worried. So there was an enormous recession, and of course no one buys a smart new London townhouse during a recession. It hit just at the wrong moment for the Adam brothers. They were anticipating making a really massive profit, and unfortunately just at the wrong moment everybody stepped away. They managed to sell one house, number 5, in the centre. They sold it to their friend, the Shakespearean actor David Garrick, who had actually been responsible for naming this development the Adelphi, Adelphi being the Greek word for brothers, and it being a project undertaken by 4 brothers collectively. The name stuck. So they sold one house, and they were in trouble, quickly sinking towards bankruptcy. So their eldest brother John took out a mortgage on the family estate of Blair Adam. Sadly, the mortgage only amounted to £36,000, so not enough, but a huge mortgage nonetheless, a mortgage actually not paid off until the time of John's grandson, so it took 3 generations to pay this mortgage off. They also published a retrospective book of their work called The Works and Architecture of Robert and James Adam, which they sold at a profit. Again, that wasn't going to cut it. So in 1773, the brothers decided to take advantage of the fact that Robert Adam, by this point, in order to elevate himself socially, had become Member of Parliament for Kinross. So Robert undertook a private act of Parliament in order to hold a lottery to sell the properties on the Adelphi. Now, I can never remember the numbers, so I'm going to have to read it. 4,370 lottery tickets sold at £50 each with 108 prizes. So, you know, houses, the Adam Brothers art collection from their grand tour, that sort of thing. Only 10 of these lottery tickets didn't sell and reverted to the Adam Brothers. So it was a very, very successful lottery. And wouldn't you just know it, a year later when the tickets were drawn, all 10 of the Adam Brothers tickets were all winners. Amazing that. So they managed to hold on to several of their properties as well as their art collection. It's a miracle. But quite a large number of people did get a house for £50, which is really rather good, actually. The lottery money kind of dug them out of a hole, but it didn't pay off their debts, so they were still in a bit of a sticky situation. So poor old Robert had to work at a ferocious pace for the rest of his life in order to keep pace with the interest on these loans. Unsurprisingly, the poor chap died in 1792, aged only 64, from a burst intestine. He essentially worked himself to death. And his younger brother James, his partner, died 2 years later from cancer, so I think ditto. Unfortunately, when Robert and James died, the Adam family had lost their breadwinners. Most unfortunate. Their style, their characteristic style, the Adam style, right up until their deaths had been incredibly fashionable and popular. They had a great many imitators. This is a lovely example of the Adam style, the famous library at Kenwood House in Hampstead. Again, do visit if you can. Unfortunately, as soon as Robert died, the Adam style fell out of fashion almost overnight. The reason being that you cannot imitate a dead person. It's not gonna wash at all. So, unfortunately, the Adam family kind of lost both their breadwinners and any capacity to make money from the surviving designs within the architectural practice. So, really rather problematic. Once both Robert and James were dead, everything they had was inherited by their youngest, slightly useless brother, William. William was the last of the 4 brothers, the Adelphi boys, and he had to, despite his lack of income, keep pace with the Adelphi loans. Unfortunately, he failed and was declared bankrupt in 1801. He then had a rather sad life and ended up committing suicide in 1822. But between 1801, when he was declared bankrupt, and 1822, when he died, he basically sold things in order to keep himself fed and a roof over his head. He started by selling his brother's art collection at sales at Christie's. He even sold their clothing. He sold their houses. Thankfully, the vast majority of the Adam Brothers art collection was purchased by Sir John Soane and can now be seen at the Soane Museum, so that's been preserved. But it's terrifying to think what treasures were lost when William was selling things off. The worst thing that he did was his treatment of the surviving Adam architectural office drawings collection. Because the Adam Brothers had been so prolific, their office was stuffed full of drawings, preliminary designs, leftover presentation drawings, office record drawings, all arranged beautifully in great big rolls of paper, one roll for each architectural project. William, with the help of a niece called Susanna, who had travelled down from Scotland to take care of her elderly uncle, decided to cannibalise these rolls of drawings. He sifted them about, he threw a great many of them away, we think about 90% of them got thrown away, and what was left he arranged into typological folios. So now we have folios of ceiling designs, folios of chimney piece designs, folios of bridge designs, etc., which is very aesthetically pleasing, but of course it means that the archaeology of patron and place has been lost. for over 4,000 drawings. I've worked out about half of those, but there's no way I'm going to sort out them all. It's more than one lifetime's work. So, well, you can ask me again when I retire. We'll see. I don't know. I think it's unlikely. Anyway, William created these folios, having thrown lots of drawings away, in the hope that they would be more saleable in that format. And he approached all sorts of people to try and sell them. He approached the British Museum, who didn't want them, which is rather pleasing for me. He'd been told by the British sculptor John Flaxman that the collection was worth 500 guineas, which was a very decent sum of money and would have kept him afloat for a little while. But of course, the Adam style was out of fashion by this point. The drawings weren't yet old enough to be of any antiquarian interest. So William failed to find a buyer. When he died in 1822, the only thing he had to leave to this poor, long-suffering niece who'd taken care of him for decades was the leftover drawings collection, which he hadn't been able to sell. Susanna returned to Scotland. She went to live with her very wealthy brother, Lord Eldin, who was a famous Scottish judge. She went to be his housekeeper, and she took the drawings with her. She wasn't terribly excited by them, but they were worth some money, so she kept hold of them. She, too, continued to try and sell them, until finally, in 1833, 41 years after Robert Adam had died, her brother, Lord Eldin, died, and his collection was sold at an auction in his smart Edinburgh townhouse. This was a very popular sale. There were so many people in the front room of this townhouse that the floor gave way, and they all fell in the carpet into the cellar below. All the artworks, all the people tumbled down, one person died, but the sale was so popular they just carried on in the cellar the next day. The only thing that didn't sell, I presume they removed the corpse, I'm not quite sure. The only thing in this sale that didn't sell was the drawings collection, because of course Susanna had realised this was an opportunity potentially to flog them, but she didn't manage it. They were the only thing that didn't sell in this hugely popular auction. So she was really quite sick of the situation. She asked her lawyer to find a buyer. The lawyer had heard of this eccentric, very wealthy architect, teacher, collector in London called Sir John Soane. So the lawyer wrote to Soane and said, "What do you think? Do you fancy them?" Unfortunately, the lawyer didn't quite explain what was being offered, and Soane sort of thought he was being offered the dregs of the collection, wasn't quite sure. He thought the price was quite low, so surely it wasn't anything interesting. So initially he turned them down. Poor Susanna was desperately upset, but realised what had gone wrong, so she instructed the lawyer to compile lists of what was in each folio. So, 600 Adam ceiling designs, 700 Adam chimney piece designs, etc., etc. So Soane then realised he was being offered the full surviving riches of the Adam collection, but he was a canny old bird, and he wrote back to Susanna and he said, "Well, yes, I am very interested. They were a generation older than me. I admired them enormously. Their drawings would make a wonderful addition to my collection. But I think you're asking quite a lot of money, and you've not sold them for 41 years. So instead of giving you 500 guineas, I'm going to give you 200 pounds. So Soane got a bit of a bargain. Susanna jumped at 200 pounds. I think she was desperate to get rid of these things by this point. However, she wasn't willing to pay for the more expensive transport of the drawings back to London in a carriage. Instead, she went for the cheapest option possible, because of course she hadn't made much money on the sale. They were sent back to London on the Soho steamer as deck cargo down the North Sea from Edinburgh to London, with nothing but a tarpaulin covering them. Fortunately for us, there was no water damage, a bit of a miracle. But they survived. They arrived in London in 1833, docked at the River Thames. They were brought to the Soane Museum in a wheelbarrow, and then, with the exception of occasional exhibition loans and partial war evacuation, they've not left the Soane Museum since. Here is one of the folios. It gives you a lovely example of what they look like. This is a nice drawing for one wall of a drawing room for the Duke of Cumberland, who was the youngest brother of King George III. It gives you a nice example of what the folios look like. And here is one of the many antiquities which was sold by William at those auctions at Christie's, and then Soane purchased the vast majority of the works in order to keep them safe. Now at the Soane Museum we have a space called the Adam Study Centre. We have 57 Adam volumes, 9,000 Adam drawings, about 82.5% of the known surviving Adam drawings in the world. I sit about 10 feet from them, which is rather pleasing. And we're very fortunate that we are getting them online, so if you're interested in them, you can go on the Soane Museum's website and have a closer look. Now, Sir John Soane, as I said, was a generation younger than Adam. He was another leading light of British architecture, but he was also a teacher. He taught as Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy in London, both architecture and architectural history. And he was teaching in almost the exact same years as the Napoleonic Wars were going on between Britain and France. He advocated that his students, around 600 young men each year, should do a grand tour, as both he and Robert Adam had done, in order to travel and see the classical style, go and look at antiquities, see the real thing, if you like. But of course, because of the Napoleonic Wars, Soane's students couldn't travel. It would have been impossible, terribly, terribly dangerous. So as an alternative, Soane collected heavily and invited these young men into his home at Lincoln's Inn Fields in London to observe his collection of artworks, antiquities, books, drawings, furniture, etc., as a sort of grand tour in microcosm. And Soane was very keen that this collection should survive as a teaching aid for everyone to use. He had unfortunately lost one son to tuberculosis and fallen out with another, bit of a disappointment, but there we are. And that meant that he had no one to leave his collection to. So in 1833, Soane applied for a private act of Parliament to leave the Soane Museum to the British nation as a national museum, under the strict proviso that nothing be changed after he died. That means we're a static collection, so we don't buy things and we don't move things about. But it's through that legacy that Soane managed to preserve not only his own name, but really to a great extent, as Paul intimated earlier, that of Robert Adam, because of course there are a great many buildings by Robert Adam surviving, but it's the drawings collection that is the sort of academic basis for our research on him. So if you're in London and you're interested, please do make an appointment and come and see some of the drawings with me. If you happen to be in London, I know it's unlikely, but before the 11th of March, do come and see the show, Robert Adams London. It's got about 40 pieces in it. I wanted to do London particularly because we always think of Robert Adam as an architect of country houses, but actually about a quarter of his time and work was expended on projects in London. So it's actually the greatest density of Adam work anywhere in the world. So I thought a fun subject. So if you manage to come and see that, I hope you enjoy it. But otherwise, I think I've talked long enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis. That was a fascinating story of speculation and entrepreneurship, which is quite at odds with the rather serene appearance of a lot of Adam's designs, to realise that he spent half his life avoiding his creditors and indeed worked himself to death. However, if there are any questions at this stage, here's one to begin with.
Of the, I believe you said 60 proposed houses that we identified?
66, actually.
66. How many were actually built?
All of them.
Really?
All of them. They were all completed, they were all decorated, they just didn't sell.
And were they destroyed because of that?
No, they survived. They were horribly bastardized during the 19th century. Awful things were done to them, concrete render, etc. And then they were demolished in 1933 in order to build a hideous Art Deco monstrosity on the site. Yeah.
So what?
On the site.
You hate
No, not the site. To build an Art Deco building on that site.
I see.
Not the Savoy.
What was the intended demographic of that housing community? Was it supposed to disseminate his style to kind of a more sort of lower class?
No, I don't think so. His style was very thoroughly disseminated by this point. I think he was catering to a market of people with whom he was already connected. He was incredibly famous, so I don't think there was really any necessity to advertise in that way. But bear in mind, it wasn't a luxury, but more a necessity for a person of a certain class, by that class I mean sort of middle class and upwards, to have both a London and a country home. You wouldn't dream of not having a London home. You wouldn't just live in the country. You would spend a portion of every single year in town. So it was quite normal to have a townhouse. And indeed the purchase and sale of property in London was far more typical than in the country. Country estates, of course, were inherited father to son. townhouses were much more easily bought and sold. For example, if you had lost your wife through female mortality and got remarried, you would buy a new London townhouse because you wouldn't want your new wife kind of haunted by the ghost of her predecessor. So that was very normal. So the acquisition of new London townhouses was sort of a normal part of Georgian life. So with the Adelphi project, I really do think that Adam was simply kind of feeding into that market. You know, a very successful one too, had it not been for the recession. So simply a speculative development in the way that speculative builders do now. You know.
So were you call them pied-à-terre, but were they fully kitted out?
Fully kitted out. They had kitchens, they had plumbing, they had water closets, they had lightning rods. Amazing. But they weren't big. You know, they were 2 rooms on each floor.
Sounds wonderful.
So really lovely, but not on a massive scale. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the Albany. Does that have any connection with this project?
No, the Albany is a little bit later, but interestingly it is built on a site which Robert Adam had worked on.
I was wondering, from your discussion of the drawings, Francis, that clearly we always think that Adam has been so widely researched and published that you're implying that there's still a lot of work to be done to clarify and elucidate aspects of Adam's work, and that can be done through the collection. Could you give us an indication of where you see gaps in the Adam scholarship?
Absolutely, there are vast gaps, and I think the reason for that is because everyone's very excited by the English country house, and so they should be, it's fabulous, but that means that other things have been ignored. So, for example, please do go online and have a look at Robert Adam's castle-style buildings. Have a look at his grottos, his rustic cottages. Have a look at his funerary architecture. I'm the only person in the world who's published anything on Adam's funerary architecture, so there's lots more to do. I've just done London, sorry, you can't have that. But you know, he did huge amounts of urban work. So Bath is a really major area. The Pulteney Bridge, for example, Adam designed the Bath New Town. Sadly, his schemes weren't executed. There is a fabulous PhD in Adam in Bath to be done. Ditto, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen. Wonderful projects that have largely been overlooked.
I hope some of that is being received by our audience.
You mentioned that Susanna went to be housekeeper of her judge uncle. What was his
Brother, Lord Eldin.
Eldin.
Not
the marbles.
Not the marbles, no.
What sort of percentage of the drawings that survive are for silver and furniture? You showed us a few examples there.
Sure. So, percentage-wise, maybe 10% is furniture, maybe 1% is silver. We do have some wonderful silver drawings, not huge numbers of them. No, the name escapes me. Someone has done a book on Adam's silver. I forget who it's by. But anyway, a small book, more work to be done if you're interested. I recently actually, for the Silver Vaults in London, collated a folder of Adam's silver drawings, and they're a lovely collection actually.
I mean, you mentioned that about 90% of the original actually were lost because
we believe they were thrown away by William when he was collating the folios. It's quite clear when you look through the drawing as a whole that William was looking for drawings in Robert's own hand, drawings which were particularly beautiful, or drawings which had a very smart aristocratic name written on them. Basically everything else was chucked away.
There's no way of knowing from letters or records what those drawings consisted of primarily. Or
well, I mean, by looking at archival material, you can essentially work out what there would have been drawings of, and for every scheme there would have been a preliminary design, something mapped out, drawn up by the draftsman, the presentation drawing, an office record drawing. So you have a minimum of 4 architectural drawings for everything that Adam designs, and we don't. So we know that they existed, and that they were thrown away by William. God knows what he did with them. I hope he didn't burn them, but anyway.
Does the pink sofa survive, and if so, where?
It does. So it's actually part of a suite. There are 2 sofas and 6 armchairs, and they were sold in the early 20th century, I think in the 20s, by the Marquises of Zetland, who were the heirs to this chap. they are all over the place. So there's a couple of chairs belong to English Heritage, a couple of chairs belong to the Victoria and Albert Museum. One of the sofas, I believe, is in a Scottish private collection. They're all over the place, I'm afraid.
Good question. You showed us a duplicated fireplace, chimney piece, but you said that the second one was actually never executed. Are there examples of things that have been executed that are duplicated?
Yes, there are, particularly those chimney pieces.
Okay.
And occasionally you get ceiling designs duplicated, particularly within London townhouses. I suspect what you get is sort of a salon being held, and someone says, "Oh, I like your ceiling," and they're just copying it, essentially,
Right,
or getting Adam to copy it. So yes, there are examples of that. It's more rare between the kind of really large, opulent country house interiors, but in London it does happen quite a bit. Yes.
I heard a lecture many years ago that emphasised that the extent to which the drawings were part of the process whereby Adam kept control of his projects, because he of course liked to not only design but keep control and profits from the construction.
Yes.
So for example, in one of his castle designs, Airthree Castle, Adam provided initial drawings, but the client didn't want to take Adam's construction firm.
Yeah.
So Adam refused to provide the finished drawings. So he ended up with a half-baked Adam castle. So is this, the drawings therefore form a central part of the Adam business?
Yes.
In that sense.
We see exactly the same thing elsewhere. Ugbrook Castle in Devon being a good example. Essentially, it's where the patron doesn't want to pay for the expensive craftsmanship, and then the drawings aren't forthcoming. So yes, the drawings are incredibly important. They are money-making in and of themselves, because a patron would have to pay for each individual drawing first before they even start building. So quite a lot of patrons would pay for their drawings and then think, "Oh crikey, I've spent all my money, I can't afford to build the actual house now." That happened quite a lot. And as you say, Adam was incredibly territorial. All of his draftsmen were required to sign a 7-year contract at the start of their work, whereby they would state that for their salary of some £40 to £60 a year, they would produce designs for the Adam brothers, albeit not making the designs themselves, and they would not, on pain of a £200 fine, produce drawings for anyone else, even their own instruction. So they were really quite harshly treated, and a lot of them left, feeling rather ill-used. Adam did call his draftsmen his beagles. I think that gives you an idea of how they were treated. So yes, I think it was incredibly difficult for them, and Adam never had students because he wasn't willing to disseminate this money-making style. And the few draftsmen that got away and became architects in their own right, so George Richardson being an obvious example, did copy the Adam style. So perhaps the Adam brothers were right to be so territorial. I'm not sure. Yes.
This is a question about the museum, the Sir John Soane Museum.
Yes.
I've been there a few times. It seems to me that recall there were some sofas
In the library dining room. Yeah.
They're Adams.
No, they're not. They're slightly later.
Oh, they are?
No, they were purchased by Soane. They're sort of off-peg furniture. They're not even designed by. They're very lovely and they are neoclassical, but they're not sort of an architect's name.
Oh, and then the other question I have is it true that the upstairs is now open? And,
It is.
And are there bedrooms there that are furnished in the style that they would have been furnished?
Yes, so what you would call the third floor of the building is now open. It's Soane's private apartments, and it incorporates Mrs. Soane's morning room and bedroom, which Soane turned into his architectural models room. There is a WC, there's Soane's own bathroom, including his bath, his bedroom, and a little space which Soane called the oratory. It had originally been his wardrobe, but he turned it into a contemplative space filled with objects associated with his wife. So after she died, he could go there to think about her. So yeah, all of those spaces are open. All of them, we're about 99% sure, are exactly as they were during Soane's lifetime. We have all the furniture, the objects, they just had to be put back, and the rooms decorated in the style they were during Soane's lifetime. And they are open to the public, but they're very small, very delicate spaces. So we only open them for tours. We don't have free flow as we do elsewhere in the museum. So do sort of look online and do a bit of planning before you next come
So
to
you
make sure
make
you
an
can see them.
appointment to see them?
Absolutely.
Oh, good.
So, speaking of the museum, all of the skylights, the last time I went there, many were covered with tarps. And
Yeah, they
things.
leak.
Are they still leaking? Or
No, we were very fortunate in 2016. The government realised that endless spending cuts weren't quite going to cut it, so they gave us £1 million to kind of shore up the building, and we spent that on all sorts of things, including re-leading the skylights. So the tops are now gone, thankfully. Phew.
And Matisse, that's what it
I was wondering if you would speak a bit about Adam's relationship to the construction firms that realized his son.
Sure. So the useless brother William, he ran a sort of agency for builders, masons, craftspeople, etc. Sort of the only thing he did. He didn't do it terribly successfully, but it did mean that Robert and James had a ready supply of useful people to work on things for them. Having said that, they were incredibly picky about the people they used. They had very, very high standards, so really the only plasterer they were ever willing to use was Joseph Rose. And if a patron wasn't willing to pay the premium rate for that very excellent plasterer, then Adam tended to go into a bit of a huff and refuse to send drawings. It's a sort of give and take relationship. Adam is very much prescribing who is being used, and as I say, it always tends to be the expensive people, because Adam, of course, wants his name and his style to be reproduced in the best way possible. But equally, it's quite a difficult relationship because Adam himself is designing everything. So these really very high caliber craftspeople are often not being given the opportunity to be as creative as they would perhaps like, or indeed they perhaps would have been working with other architects. The only exception to that are the decorative painters. They were allowed to design their installations, the medallions, the wall panels, the ruinscapes, etc. And I have a rather uncharitable theory about that. I think that Adam let them do their own thing because he was slightly rubbish at iconography.
So the Etruscan Room drawings that we saw were by Adam's office, or are the painters doing the kind
No,
of
so
thing?
the decorative painters that I'm talking about are the ones who produce the medallions, you know, the three graces, and when you have paintings inset into plaster ceilings.
Oh, I see.
Everything else is all Adam. So that lovely Etruscan Room drawing is designed by Adam, and it's drawn by one of his beagles, his draftsmen. Yeah.
And the glass room, was glass as in mirrored glass or transparent glass?
As in transparent glass, which is painted on the back and has gilded mirrors overlain, hung on top. Really extraordinary. I mean, you wouldn't want to drop anything in that room. You could destroy the thing, but yeah, fabulous. Sadly, it didn't. That room didn't quite take off in the way that Adam had hoped, because the Duchess of Northumberland, as soon as the room was completed, fell ill, and the family didn't really entertain, so no one ever really saw it properly.
Do you know which manufacturer he contracted to make the glass paintings?
Yes, but I have to remember the name. It's one which John Adam was a partner in the firm, so the family was making money from it. This happened quite a lot, but I'm afraid I can't remember what the firm's called. Apologies. No, can't remember. Sorry.
You're referring, very interestingly, to some of these financial arrangements and contractual arrangements. Where are the records for this?
They are nearly all in one of two places. So the National Library of Scotland has a good collection because of the Drummonds Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland archive having been moved there, and the Adam Brothers Bank with Drummonds. All of their financial records have come through that way. And all of the correspondence, or nearly all of it, is still in Blair Adam, the family home, which is lived in by a direct descendant of the eldest brother John. Keith Adam lives there. He's such a nice man. He lets people look at stuff.
So he still owns this archive?
He owns it and struggles with it. The house is sort of falling down and whatnot, but he's doing a really great job to hold it together.
Good, thanks. Good, well, if that has exhausted the subject, I asked you to give Francis a vote. And I can only hope that this was opened up a great seam of research into 18th century British decorative arts. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much.